I want to take a bit of a deeper look into survey methods. Now, these are most likely to be used in areas like public health. So this is an area where nutrition students need to pay more attention than maybe a biochemist, who's less likely to use these methods in the future. Now, I said before that within a population, not everyone's easy to get at, so are you picking the low-lying fruit? If people are filling an online survey, can you control who's participating? When you're knocking on doors for a survey, that's fine, you know about all the homeowners, but what about the homeless people? Were they making a serious contribution? If you're living in a country which has indigenous populations, and particularly migratory indigenous populations, for example Berbers and Tuareg, if you're looking in Morocco and Tunisia, or if you're looking at Native Americans who don't have fixed homes, then how do you do your survey? And the question you always have to ask are members of your sample representative? Now, one thing you can do is get a population list. But does a population list exist? And if it does exist, is it actually real? Telephone directories used to be a way of doing things. Now, most people are not in the telephone directory. There's electoral registers, but again, people can opt to be off the electoral register. Who opts to be off the electoral register? Do they opt to be off equally from all of the different political views or from all of the different social classes? What's likely to happen with your list, and is it likely that it's representative and unbiased? Even if you've got a population list, does it make it easier to do sampling? So if I want to do a gender specific question, I need to be able to figure out from my list what the gender of people are. But there's quite a lot of names that are not gender specific. So I could end up selecting men when I wanted a survey to be women only, or women when I want it to be a male only selection. It's difficult to tell. Do I actually want it to be completely random? If I've got confounding variables, then I will need to take these into account. I might want to have limits on gender, limits on age, limits on ethnicity. If I'm looking at a study of white people's views on racism or the views on Black Lives Matter, then I obviously don't want to include black people or in the list. Are there any complete population lists? So even the survey, the most complete survey you would anticipate of existing, the census, is not a complete list. And in some cases it can be corrupted. So they found in Japan that they got more people who were over 100 than actually could possibly be alive. Convenient sampling is the type of sampling that you might experience when you're going down the street and suddenly someone comes up to you with a clipboard and says, "Will you take part in my survey?" So the way they work is they collect data until they've got the number that they want. So they're told at the start of the day, I need 200 responses to this survey. So they sit there and wait until they get 200 people who will participate. Now, who fills in these surveys? Who stops and responds to the people with the clipboard? Are they equally representative of the true population that you're looking at? Now, probably not, because the type of people who can stop and fill in the survey is not a representative sample of the population. Now, here's a particularly amusing example of a survey conducted by Sheer Height in her American sexology findings. So this was, I think, published in that famous scientific journal Cosmo, and she wanted to carry out a survey about the attitudes of American women, or their experiences. So 70% of the women who participated in this survey who'd been married for more than 5 years were having affairs, usually for emotional closeness rather than sex. 76% of the women didn't feel guilty, 84% were emotionally unsatisfied, and 95% reported emotional and psychological harassment from their male partners. Now, this seems a fairly damning indictment of American men. It sounds like American men are not great. So let's dig a bit deeper into Sherhite's study. It was 4,500 women. That's a very large sample size. They're aged from 14 to 85. I'm concerned about how many 14-year-olds have been married for 5+ years. I know underage marriage is a potential possibility in the US, but I think that's pushing it. And I'm also concerned about 85-year-olds who are having affairs. Seems a bit odd. Now, the first indication that there might be something going on here that's a bit strange is that it's a 127 item questionnaire. That's a very long survey. You have to be quite a determined person to complete 127 questions. Is it a good sample? Well, it seems large enough, but when you find out that she sent the questionnaire to hundreds of thousands of people and only got 4,000 returns, then big warning flags come up. Because what you're getting is a very low response rate to sending out the survey to a massively wide audience. Now, this low response rate means you're only going to end up with a sample of the people who can be bothered to respond, and they're not representative. So in this case, they're the people who are angry and have an axe to grind and really want to respond to this because they want to let out their frustration. But the other 95% of the population who got the survey were quite content. They didn't want to raise these issues and there weren't these problems. So this is what happens when you get a completely biased survey. Now, other examples of this, so Stanley Milgram did a famous experiment called 6 degrees of separation. So what he did was he went somewhere to the Midwest, he handed out sets of envelopes and said, just by sending this to people you know, I want you to get it to my friend who happens to be the vicar of this college in New Hampshire or somewhere. Maybe Massachusetts. Doesn't matter. Somewhere on the East Coast. And you just had to send it to friends. Now what he found out was, on average, the ones that got to his friend, this particular vicar, arrived in about 6 steps from the person he'd given it to. But what he forgot to say was, okay, 20, maybe 50 of them arrived, but he'd sent out thousands. So often there was no 6-step connections between the person he gave the envelope to originally and his friend. Another example of this, Metro polls. So according to a Metro poll, the majority of readers want to return to the death penalty. But this is not true if I actually ask the British population. In fact, most news polls, most polls in media networks are going to have bias, because the only people who fill them in are the people who are so driven by ideological belief that they want to fill them in. So your Daily Mail reader fills it in because they want to and they're driven to do so. The same with your Fox News watcher or your Sky News watcher. You're not sampling truly from the population.